Hey class, this is Mr. Schmidt, and we are starting to talk about the biogeography that starts our lab project. All right, so in order to study biogeography, you have to remember what latitude is, which is how far north or south something is. So biogeography, we're going to be looking at the rate of species in a specific location, like an island, and then the number of species present on that location, for example, the island. Okay, so our goal is you'll be able to list the conditions that promote diversity of species. Okay, so what factors are related to species richness? So, for example, here we're looking at a lot of different flowers all in one location. This whole slideshow, by the way, I took from from Portland State University's environmental science program, and they listed four different factors: latitude, how far north or south something the island is; how long that island has existed there. Okay, so the amount of time, the size of the island or the size of the habitat, and the distance from other similar habitats. Okay, so in order to come to these realizations, they did a number of different studies to find this. First of all, they looked at islands and the number of bird species, and they see that the number of birds increase as they increase the size of the islands. This is in hectares. Okay. Then they looked at both plants and butterflies, and they also found that as the area of the islands increased, the number of species increased. Okay, now this is not perfect. Okay, notice it's very hard to standardize all those other variables when you're just looking at size. So some of this range will have a lot to do with latitude and time, but in general, they see some data, some trend in the upward direction that supports this. Okay. Um, then they looked at, does it have to be islands or is it specifically biomes and size of the biome? So they have all these different kinds of fish, and they looked at the species richness versus the number of reaches, or the amount of water um, within this area. Okay, and they found that the fish also increased as a function of size. Okay, now if you've ever used the log button on your calculator, you realize it is a way of tracking increasing numbers. Very large numbers and very small numbers are all on the same scale. So, for example, the Richter scale uses it. So, if you go from a 1 to a 2, you have 10 times bigger earthquakes. And if you go from a 2 to a 3, your earthquakes are now 10 times more intense. And then 3 to 4 is 10 times more intense than that. Okay, that's what a log scale does. And what these scientists discovered is that the number of species versus the area follows a log-based scale, and that's true for no matter where you start. Okay, so now we have a number of different scientists testing a number of different islands for a number of different species. Okay, they have nice reproducible results. Um, so that reinforces some the ideas. So now that they came and they looked at even more islands and they tracked again species across islands compared to New Guinea. Okay, um, and what they found is that if New Guinea is one of the largest islands with some of the most species. Okay. Oh, by the way, in terms of latitude, it's very close to the equator. So that's why we'd expect it to have a large number of species. It's also a fairly old island. So double count in terms of why it has such a large species count. Okay, and then we can start plotting some lines that project out what is happening within these different groups. So every line we point for like a best fit, we're seeing that there's a very clear correlation between the size of the island and the number of species. Okay, and that's what we're trying to test in our lab. Okay, um, and that's all based on the number of the density and percent saturation of all these points. Um, so trying to see if we can go to, um, so you can track birds. There was also, did I skip the ants? Okay. One of these, they were counting all the ants for the islands. And No, I can't imagine wanting to sit around and count ants all day. But that is exactly what some scientists did. They counted all the different types of ants. Um, and these studies go back, 50, 60 years um, towards correlating with all these things. Okay, so they've noticed it in birds, and fish, and plants, and butterflies, and ants. So we have all sorts of different data points, all pointing towards the same trend. Okay, and that trend is that large islands close to the mainland should have a lot of different species diversity and species richness, and small islands very far away should have very low species richness. Okay. Um, and again, we can get them with equilibrium. And this is our clear goal here of if you're close to the mainland, you're going to get a lot of birds coming in, and you're not going to have many species dying off. Um, but at some point, reach this equilibrium point where the number of animals entering and the number of animals either departing or dying equals out. And that will give you a stable equilibrium point. So the older islands are going to reach a point where they're no longer increasing the number of species, but instead they're very constant. Interesting, when we look at humans, Japan has kind of reached that point where the number of people born in Japan and the number of people who leave or die in Japan uh, is fairly close to constant. Okay, we can compare that to places like Nigeria. Nigeria has a lot of people being born. Their population is very young. Very few people are dying, so they are very much on the increase. Okay, and they happen to be in mainland, which I don't know if that has anything connected to human behavior, but it is helpful for their economy. Okay, so we can also see this in human populations. We can see it in economics, where you have your inputs and your costs. Okay, um, so this is a very common graph that we'll look at. Okay, and then one of the more interesting experiments, rather than just testing islands that already exist, they took this super tiny island off of Florida, killed off all the animals, all the arthropods on this tiny little mangrove island, and then reproduced the data again. This is by Florida State University, and again found the same results. All those same data points. That Florida is relatively close to the equator. It's a latitude. It's a tiny island. It's close to the mainland. They could keep testing all their variables across this point, and what they do is they see these trends similar with the French study as well. Okay. So we can look at all these things and we can use physical islands to model other things. Okay. So islands themselves are very specific, but biomes can act like islands. Okay. So, like the top of Mount Hood is similar to the top of Mount Rainier, similar to the top of Mount Adams. Those act as islands of different habitats. And if the animals can exist on the top of one of those islands, if they can manage to make it all the way to the next mountaintop, they can also survive there. Okay. Um, if you go to the grocery store parking lot, there's little bits of grass in between each bit of pavement. That becomes its own little biome where the ants and the spiders and the weeds all try to migrate into this island of grass surrounded by the sea of pavement. Okay, so this becomes a good model for us to look at other isolated biomes as well. Okay, and we can use this to look at things like national parks. So we have Yellowstone, and we have other national parks that do not have any human structures on it. So those can also be looked at and see if we can model the same thing as we look at area and rate of extinction. Okay. So when we look at things like wolves and bison and all sorts of other species, we can see that the bigger the area is, the more likely those species are to survive. Okay. Okay, so just to reinforce this, if we look at the Hawaiian Islands, this is the newest island with active volcanoes, and it's actively adding mass to the island every time there's a volcanic eruption. Okay, so has the shortest amount of time, but also the largest area. And then as we go back, we go to older and older islands. So we would expect this being one of the oldest islands, but still of some size, would have a great deal of diversity. Okay, but islands over here, where it's relatively new and small, should have the least amount of diversity, and that's what we're looking for. We're looking at how much time does it been in existence, how much size does it have, how far is it from the mainland? These are all relatively about the same distance from the mainland, okay? And their latitude, and Hawaii being close to the equator, these are all about the same latitude. So there's a number of different ways we can look at all these, and that's what we're going to be trying to do in the lab, and I'll share that in our next video. Okay, but with that, I bid you good day, and I'll talk to you shortly about the lab.